Om Shanti, everyone. My name is Michelle. I am your MC tonight, and we may have a surprise. I may be the presenter as well. So let's see, there's always some exciting drama. Well, happy September. When I woke up this morning, it's funny, I looked at my calendar, it wakes me up very early, and I saw September 1, and I went, September 1? That's impossible. Where did August go? But time is just rolling. Well, it turns out I am just the MC. We're in luck. The presenter just showed up. So I will introduce him in a minute. His name is Brother Tony. I'm sure you know Brother Tony, Antonio Figueroa. He will be our guest presenter today. And this month, the month of September 1, so we're getting a quick start to it, is subject matter is peace, a gift from God, because it is a gift for all of us. And our innate quality, as I study and learn, it is an innate quality. That neuroses that I usually feel is not my innate quality. That comes from the outside that I just sponge in. Really deep down, I am at peace, and I've always sought peace. I didn't know it was within me. But tonight, our subject, which was chosen by our speaker, Brother Tony, is making peace. And I like that he picked that topic, making peace, because it's a verb, to make. And it's not just a passive endeavor. Peace is not, as I used to believe, oh, I'm going to go somewhere, I'm going to relax, I'm not going to think about anything, and I'm just going to chill, and peace, I'll be peaceful. But the minute I went back to work or I got home, it started again. So obviously it was not working. It was just a temporary thing. So I'm very interested to hear this discussion tonight. Peace is, you can have either conflict or you can have resolution, you can have peace, or you could be aggressive. And I come from the land of politics. That was my previous job, and I'm still in government. And I found in the US, sometimes politicians have a tendency to be hawkish and aggressive. They have aggressive tendencies. And why is that? They don't want to look soft. There are many, I can give you many anecdotes that I've had on a personal level of talking to fellow politicians who do not want to look weak. They think being peaceful is weak. They think they should be aggressive and assertive. And I always had trouble with that because on the other end, I was always seeking peace. And one anecdote I wanted to bring up, and I discussed this with Tony, is I was on a mission, if you will. I thought very much that the United States should have a secretary of peace. We have a secretary of state, we have a secretary of transportation, we have a secretary of defense. No secretary of peace. Does that mean it's not a priority for this country? All we talk about is bringing peace to the world, to being the light of the world. So I actually had an opportunity to speak to a senator, a very senior senator, in a presentation that he had done. And during the presentation, he asked if there were questions. And I asked, would you support having a secretary of peace? What do you think of that? Well, what do you think his answer was? In front of a whole room full of people. Miss, or Madame, whatever he wanted to call me, that's ridiculous. He looked at me with such contempt. That's a ridiculous question. We should have a secretary of peace. That's what a secretary of state is for. I said, no, that's really not. It's a little bit different. You're sending a different message when you're sending it a secretary of peace. So I'm always going to hope for that. And tonight we have an opportunity to discuss that, and maybe we can bring that on, because if you want peace, it begins with you. And I am more peaceful. So maybe if I think about it, maybe we will have a secretary of peace someday. So I want to welcome our speaker for tonight, who is Brother Tony, Antonio Figueroa. He is an architect and a planner in New York City. He has worked as a governmental official, so he knows government. And he's a corporate manager. In addition to his own practice, he's an architect. And at LHP Architects, his works are stints in Europe and Asia. And he has been a student of Raja Yoga meditation for well over 20 years. And his involvement with the Brahma Kumaris includes facilitating retreats for his professional community, as well as programs to bring about the understanding of spirituality, particularly, and this is what I like because I'm still working, in the context of professional life, because oftentimes a lot of the strife that I feel in the polarization, if you will, sometimes is in the work environment. And he brings a very special understanding to that. And I'm welcome him tonight. And I love the subject matter that he picked, making peace. Can't wait to get started. Thank you for joining us, Brother Tony. Welcome.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I'm sorry for the technical glitches.
No problem. We're
the
good.
technical glitches here should not be any different than the ones in my office where I have an IT department. So it doesn't matter. For me, they seem to follow me around like a plague.
Okay.
The anecdote you raised, and let me start with a personal anecdote too, because the issue of peace is something that is a very personal thing, and it should be a very personal thing. Originally, I thought that peace was the absence of conflict. That was to stop the tension in our life, and that would relieve us or free us. That we need to go someplace which is not filled with tension, or someplace peaceful. But that's just an anecdote. It's personal, because that's what I used to feel. That was how you achieve peace. You stop the conflict. But basically, we have to start with what exactly are we talking about in terms of peace. There is a cliche statement is I'm looking for peace. I want to find peace. So what does that really mean? That implies that we actually know what it is. If we want to find it, are we going to recognize it somewhere? Are we going to have some idea of what it is when we see it? So if we want to find peace, how do we do that? Do we know what it is? Will we know it if it hit us in the face? We would recognize it. It would imply that we know what it is. It would imply that we have some sort of memory of it, that we will recognize it. So that is basically the way peace is being characterized now. We have to make a journey to find peace. We have to go somewhere to look for this. And I give you my personal anecdote. Others consider peace, which is what Michelle was talking about, a process of reconciliation. To make peace with your adversary and negotiate between combatants, or to make peace with yourself and accept your circumstances. So you have all of these, spending time in nature, taking responsibility for actions, and there's a whole litany of things that we can talk about that really all kind of bring us back to the whole notion of peace. My feeling, and the common theme through all of these things that I think we can draw, even given all the cliches, is that peace does not happen of itself. It's not independent of us. It doesn't materialize somewhere in some Shangri-La environment where all of a sudden all our troubles kind of melt away. It's an affirmative act. It's something that reflects something that we have, an action that we take. It could be a thought. It could be an action. It could be a reflection, but it's something that we do. It's not passivity. That's not peace. As a matter of fact, if we look at the great leaders that used peace as their premise, were not passive people. Certainly Nelson Mandela and Mohandas Gandhi were not passive people. Yet peace was the banner under which they led their countries to change. So it's not passivity. It's not letting things be. It's not letting things be. Letting things be doesn't necessarily give you peace. It just, you let things be, and they may come back and in another form. So it's not letting things be. So in every instance that we have tried to identify regarding peace, there is some kind of effort required, some effort on our part for this goal of peace. So my theme of making peace is that it is not something that happens. It is something that we do. It's something that some action on our part that makes it possible for us to kind of achieve a certain amount of equilibrium and balance in our lives. That I think is the first issue that I wanted to kind of bring to the fore, because we not we, but generally speaking, people in general talk about peace as a particular process that they're going to travel to internally or externally to find. It's something that we're going to find, that it's going to be visible or manifest at the end of some path. But I think the most important thing for us in terms of peace is to determine that we are going to make an action to bring this into our life. It's not going to come into our life of its own. It's not like time. It's not like the weather. It's not like other aspects of our existence where things happen to us irrespective of what we do, which is why it's so valued, because it doesn't happen no matter what. It happens only under certain circumstances. And people are basically hoping that they can go to some place and have that circumstance happen to them. And that, I think, is not the way to find peace. I'm reminded of all the shows, movies that they have about particular people in some sort of Eastern meditative discipline that are, were able to stop their thoughts and achieve some sort of equilibrium internally. But for the moment, let's look at that, because that's one of the most common. I think it's primarily a Buddhist discipline, but I'm sure other people have appropriated, in which you basically want to stop your thoughts or arrest your thoughts so that you can acquire a certain amount of balance. But for those of you who have tried that kind of meditation, it's extremely difficult. It is very, very hard to stop your thoughts, since your mind is made to think. And your brain issues between 50 and 80 million pulses a day that are basically our thoughts. So even that process, and I have great admiration for Buddhist discipline, even that process is an extremely affirmative, active point where people stop their thoughts, are able to rest them enough so they can begin to find a place for themselves. So even that, which is the kind of model that everybody looks at, that is a very affirmative, active position. So peace is something that we do, something that we make happen, not something that just happens to us. And that's kind of the first part of this examination, is how do we define this? Because I think the first most critical step is to make sure that you're in the right place. Okay, you're in the right direction. And the other part of this process is you have to be in a position to have some sort of belief, at least 50% belief, that it exists, that it's out there, that you'll find it, that it'll come to you, or that you'll make it. If you're looking for something that you don't believe exists, that you don't believe is real, chances of finding it are going to be very, very slim. I would say they're going to be zero. Because even when you're looking for stuff that you believe in, that you feel exists, you have trouble finding it for certain things. Certainly something that you don't really believe in, you're not going to find. It's not going to be there. Wherever it's manifest, you're not going to see it. So the second part of this is to say, okay, we have to have at least the expectation somewhere in our consciousness that it is something that might be attainable, something that might be achievable. It's very important way to kind of focus this effort. You can't be looking for something you don't believe exists. And it's very important. If you don't believe it exists, then it's something you shouldn't be looking at for. Not because someone says it exists that you have to go and find out. It's something that you do that's very personal, that is not a challenge to the world. It is basically a decision and an exercise you make for yourself on the assumption that there's something out there that's of particular value that you seek. So that is the second step. So you have to have some sense that this thing that we seek, that's something that exists, that's something that is somewhere a reality. And I think the last thing that we have to look at, and this is to me really important because it's been important in my engagement with the Brahma Kumaris, is that seeking for something like this outside of yourself is a real problem, because the world that exists outside of yourself is very much a changing world. To use kind of very hackneyed examples, you want to go to a idyllic island and stay there for 2 weeks, except who knows, the idyllic island may have a volcano or may have an earthquake. That's happening in many places in the world. So outside is temporary. You can find some beautiful places, some very restful places, but it's outside of yourself. So it's basically something that's temporary and not something that's sustainable. And maybe that's the last issue that I kind of want to frame, is that it has to be something sustainable. We're not looking for peace that lasts for 2 minutes or 2 days or a week or something. We want something that gives us a certain amount of balance, that is sustainable, that we can hold on to some level. So that's kind of how I frame the issue of peace, and that's why I call it making peace. Making peace has a lot of connotations. The making peace is term used to reconcile conflicts and to making peace is to have when two people come in agreement over something, and so it's something that's affirmative. So we have this kind of framework. So then what do we do? How do we start this process? And I'm going to use a kind of a statement from some other programs that I've been involved with. And it's something that I really feel is very important. There's a term in Hindi or maybe it's Sanskrit, it's called ahimsa. The term ahimsa is used to mean nonviolence. But in reality, ahimsa is a much more subtle and much more profound word. It talks about not doing harm. You do no harm. And maybe a couple of thousand years, or I don't know how long after this ahimsa concept became part of the Hindu tradition, you have the Greek physician Hippocrates, who was the one that codified the medical profession. And his first tenet of training to be a healer is first, do no harm. This is his first tenet. You do no harm. To me, that is basically the fundamental quality of sustainability, not just in personal, emotional, spiritual, but in everything, in terms of the environment, in terms of every single action that we have in our life, in our existence, in the whole world. If we have one thing that actually works in every single context, is first, do no harm. Because then whatever you do afterwards is beginning to make things better. And it's a very important quality. So it's what I think I would call the basic tenet of the language of peace. You do no harm. That's, to me, like the fundamental premise that you have to look at. Because if anything you're going to do is going to create any conflict in you or in anyone else, then you're not going in the right direction. The peace is not something that you achieve after a bunch of conflict and then you stop the conflict. And then we call that peace. That is certainly not the peace that we're talking about. Peace starts from the inception of the thought, of the action, of the sensibility of the consciousness. You start with the premise that you're not going to hurt yourself or anybody else in the process. Anything that does not have that as its basis is going to have something that's going to be very temporary. And I know about solving problems and creating procedures and protocols and methods. I was a bureaucrat and I work in the private sector. I do a lot of work for public sector companies, public sector for government agencies. So I understand the whole process of reconciliation in terms of resolving conflicts and issues. But if you start first with the premises, you're not going to create any conflict, do no harm, you have the basis to be able to go forward from there. And the second issue that I think is kind of follows from this is that what exactly is it that you're trying to do in whatever action you're doing to kind of achieve some sort of equilibrium, some sort of state of peace. And the important thing is to understand where the motivation is coming from. When you're looking at things intellectually, which is something that I am very prone to do, when you're looking at things from a very logical, rational point of view, it's very rewarding because you get to solve a problem. You get to say, okay, I define this and now I have a solution for it that makes sense. And I very much like that. I mean, I would not be honest if I wasn't saying that. I like the fact that if I'm given a task and I do the task, I feel very good about it. However, that does not bring peace. That brings some level of satisfaction, some level of validation, but peace comes from something that's more fundamental than the rationalistic logic of your thinking. It comes from something more centered. We usually say it comes from the heart, or it comes from the basis of emotion. So So when you're looking at peace, aside from the first issue, the language of peace, if we want to use a term like that, that seems very kind of very wide, but you want to go and do this from an affective, not an intellectual perspective. You have to do it from a feeling perspective. What is your sense of what's happening in whatever context you're in? And what is a sense of how you're responding to that situation? If the response is not centered in some sort of basic emotional, effective understanding of what you're dealing with, then you have to be careful, because the intellect, particularly the intellectual rationalization, can basically rationalize just about anything. That's the nature of it. So we can do a lot of rationalization of positions that sometimes when we go look back in retrospect, don't seem as positive and as appropriate as we thought they were. So you have to kind of go back to that position. It says, okay, it's position of humility. You're not going in saying, I know, I understand. You have to go in saying, I don't know, and I don't understand, which is why we have this issue. And we have to come in with some sort of humility to say, okay, what is it that we can do to understand? I'd like to use an anecdote of a fellow who's done a lot of work with the BKs and no longer is involved with us. His name was Roger Salant. He was a kind of a genius manager with Ford, and his task was opening multi-billion-dollar plants. The guy was really, really very, very, very skilled manager. So he gave us a bunch of anecdotes. We did a couple of retreats with him, and one of the anecdotes he gave us was a plant that he was opening in Brazil, on which the company had invested a huge amount of billions of dollars. And basically every manager that went down there came back and told the court executives, there's no way it's going to happen. It's not happening. So they sent Roger Salant down there. So Roger went down and took the measure of what's going on, went around, talked to everybody in the plant, talked to all the managers, talked to the vendors, talked to everybody. And he went and said, okay, we're closing down this operation for 2 weeks. And he went and spent 2 weeks engaged with every single player in this process. And he came from a process of humility, okay? He didn't come in saying, I'm the manager. I'm gonna tell you guys what to do. You're gonna do what I say, which is how probably the other people were doing. Roger came in and he said, this is what we're going to do. We're gonna shut this down and I'm gonna find out what everybody feels. Not what they're thinking, because what they're thinking, they weren't articulating because they were talking to the boss. It's what they're feeling. He spent 2 weeks literally just meeting with people, socializing with them, understanding them. And after 2 weeks, he got a strategy for reopening the plant, a plant that the entire Ford executive plant felt was not, executive level thought it was not feasible. And he got it open. Now, did he go in there with tasks, metrics, all kinds of other stuff? All of which was available to him, obviously. No, he went to understand what the problem was. And most importantly, he made peace. And only through that peace was this very, very important commercial goal achievable. So, that to me is the most important thing in terms of peace that we can have some aspire to, can engage in, that we have some measure of control over. That is the peace that we're looking to make. Peace that is sustainable and a peace that resolves a conflict without creating new ones. So that kind of frames the issue of peace. I think, I'm not sure how much time I have, but I think maybe Michelle, you might have something to kind of come in with, or we have some sort of interactive process with the rest of the participants. You're muted, Michelle. You're muted. You're muted. Michelle, you're muted.
I know I had to find my button.
Oh.
Hi. Anyway, yes, I muted because I have a lot of noise around me, and when I'm here, I want to concentrate, so I mute, so you don't have to hear the phones going off in my head. Anyway, you brought up a couple of very cogent points, and some of them you had actually touched on what I was going to talk about, ask you about do no harm, because I agree. Do no harm is a very important concept, and I think you explained it beautifully. And you went a step further than I would even think, that's the baseline. That is the floor of where you begin looking for peace. I also like the fact that you said, well, you recognize peace, and that gave me thought too. I think I know what peace is, but would I really recognize true peace? Because I've never, living in this world, I've never had true peace, because to me, peace is everlasting, and a concept that would be longer than drops. I get drops of peace, but peace, a sustained peace, as you point out, I'm still a work in progress. So would I recognize it? I like that concept you brought up. Would I recognize it when I see it? Because I've never really had it. But the fact that I yearn for it, because I've yearned for it as long as I remember, seeking peace, and that what's probably brought me to this place, Brahmakar, is they say you can't look for something you haven't felt. So I do believe that I have had that, maybe not in this life, but I've had that feeling, that deep, as you say, feeling of peace, because why do I hunger for it if not the fact that I've had it before? So, and I like also one thing, this ties in beautifully, this subject, Tony, because one thing that always happens whenever we have this discussion on Thursday night, I always think it comes down to a choice that we make. And you kind of framed it that way. It's a choice that we make. Do we really want peace? And what if it's active? We have to make a choice to get to that. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about.
I would not characterize it as a choice.
Okay.
I would say that
for a personal.
I would say that you first, and I mentioned this before, you first have to have the feeling that you want this, that this is something you want. Okay. Now I know people in my profession who like the tension.
Yes. Yeah.
I was one of those people. So I know exactly what they're like. I like the tension. I thought it was motivational. I thought it gave me energy. So if you like the tension, if you like the conflict, you're already not on a basis to look for peace, because you don't believe it's of any value to you. So the issue is it of value to you? If it's not of value to you, then you better not look for it, because you're not going to find something that you're really not interested in looking for. So it's not really a choice. A choice means that you say, okay, I have this option versus that option. No. You have to first have a consciousness that, okay, I believe at least 50%. Let's use a scientific model, okay? 50% of you believes that it exists, just like 50% or more of a scientist believes in a particular axiom. He would not be pursuing it and spending 4 years or 10 years of his life trying to prove it if he didn't believe it existed. And that's science. That's not even spirituality, okay? So you have to start with the premise. If you believe it exists, not if you say it's an idealized version of the universe that I don't believe is really possible, then why would you be looking for it? There will be no purpose in it. So it's not really a choice. It's really a mindset. When you put it when you make it as a choice, then people say, well, I can choose either of these things, because that's not what we're doing. To do peace, you have to say, okay, I think it's feasible. I think it's possible. And then I do something about it.
Mhm.
All right. And that's why I framed it in that way, because I think that it's one of those things in our life. I mean, it's like love. Love is not a choice. Love is you have a emotional engagement and you go with it. You don't say, should I do this? This is like an arranged marriage. Should I do this? Should I? No, that's not what it is. It's emotional choice. By the time you're thinking about it, you've already made the choice. You've already gone. You're already on the way. So I think the issue with peace is the same. When you say, I want to create peace in my existence, you've already said to yourself, I think it's possible. Maybe hard, but it's possible. If you
Mhm.
don't believe it exists, then it's not a choice. Then you've already chosen. You're saying it doesn't
Mhm.
exist. All
Mhm.
right. So that's why I would not characterize it as a choice, because I think
Okay.
that goes back to the beginning as to whether or not peace exists.
Okay. I think I don't disagree with you in the least. I think, like you in the beginning, what I mean in my younger days, I liked the energy. It kept me going. I thought it was
Oh, yes.
necessary for me to sustain me. I still am high energy, but it's a different type of energy. It was an anxiety. It was something, it fueled me. But I think what I meant by choice, and I don't disagree, but once I decided that I didn't like it. I wanted that peace, that the choice was I didn't have to be the other way. I could seek a means. That's what I meant by choice, that once I discovered that peace can be within me and I've seen others find it and I wanted it so badly, then the choice is how do I get to that point? And that's where it led me. I think all roads lead to where I am now, to that path of peace, and I'm still on it. And I agree with you that it is an action that you have to take. You have to work at. It is not sitting on an island, as you point out. It is an active, and frankly, I think it's something that I think about in a good way a lot. It's not something passive. I think, am I at peace? How do I feel? I'm always that term we use, check and change. Am I at peace now? How do I get to that? And sometimes that is summoning. For me, it's summoning a spirit bigger than myself to fill me with something else. One thing, yeah,
There's nothing wrong with being on an island, by the way. We don't want to
yeah,
trash.
I agree.
I right now would be very happy to this weekend to be going to an island by a beach, have a lot of nature, and
Yeah,
yeah. So it's not
right,
that I don't want anybody to go away thinking that
right,
we are knocking that.
right.
Nature is a wonderful thing. I have
Okay.
one anecdote that I want to make, and then
And
there's
then
some
we do have
questions,
some
right?
questions,
Right.
Tony. Go
So they
ahead.
have an
No, go
anecdote
ahead.
about making peace.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of two part. One
Mm-hmm.
is I have a friend of mine who was an architect who went to South Africa and became very enamored with South Africa, married a South African woman, and he told me he met Mandela. And it's very interesting. When he met him, he was able to meet Mandela, which was not an easy thing, but this guy was a resourceful fellow. He said he went to a restaurant where this guy was at, and Mandela was on the second floor. And he said, as he went to the restaurant, right, he felt increasing levels of calmness as you
Mm-hmm. I believe it.
went up. And finally, when he got to Mandela, it was like totally still. He could almost feel the air be still. So people who really are really make peace, because Mandela was an activist, make peace, they make it. They literally make it. You feel
Agree.
it. It's not a
Agree.
question of it. It's unique. They
I
make it.
agree.
They create it. And I had a somewhat similar experience with one of the head of the UN, the Secretary General. I was interviewed for a job there, and I went through a series of interviews, and then finally I went to talk to him. And the same thing happened as I went through successive layers. When I finally got to his office, it was absolutely still. This guy was extremely soft-spoken, very, very, very friendly, very gentle. And so these people are people that are affirmative. They're making things. Just
Mhm.
because they're not
Right.
creating a lot of conflict doesn't mean they're not doing something. They're certainly doing something.
I love that.
So anyway, those are
I love
anecdotes
that.
about making peace.
I love that. I've had that too, Tony. I've met two people. I will, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into my story, but some people make donuts and some people make peace. And I have met people who make peace, and I have felt the same way. You can feel it when you walk into the room.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It is transformative and you want it to stay with you. But like you said, you have to make it. You can absorb theirs for a while. It did last for a bit, but eventually it fades. You have to be like, you make the donuts, you make peace. I love that, Tony. Bingo. Okay, we got a couple of questions here. Okay, one of them was, how can we not be provoked, let alone do no harm? And I like that question because a lot of times people, and I know you can hit this one out of the park, you feel like you're provoked, and how do you, forget do no harm? What if you're provoked? And I
Well,
love you.
there's no such thing
Yes.
as not being provoked.
Mhm,
Okay. If someone wants to provoke you,
mhm.
you will be provoked. They will say something.
You let
Even
them.
a relative, a
Mhm,
business associate will say something hurtful, will say something that can be extremely devastating. Okay. Peace is not about avoiding life. Okay. You will be provoked. You will be challenged. That's not going to stop. That's the reason we're on this earth. What happens is not your first reaction when you're provoked. When someone says something, a relative or an associate or a colleague says something hurtful to you, that's being human. Okay. We haven't all achieved nirvana and are able to just let these things roll off our backs. Certainly I'm not like that. However, the most important thing is that you not react. You have to respond. So when someone says something provocative, or more pointedly, intentionally hurtful, let's not just leave it at provocative, because that implies that there's some sort of dual message. Let's assume the person is trying to hurt you. So let's get down to the point that he's not implying he's going to hurt you, but he's hurting you, or she's hurting you. So you're hurt. We don't stop being hurt in life. Someone stabs you with a knife, you're going to bleed. If someone does anything, you're going to hurt. The question is that hurt going to go on for the rest of your life, for the next 6 weeks, for the next 2 days? How long is that hurt going to last? Because once you get hurt, and I'm going to use the analogy of medicine, you first go in and find out what happened, what was damaged, what was the nature of the injury, and you start patching that injury, right? You don't sit around saying, oh, I stepped on this nail, or I got cut with this, and how terrible, what my luck is so terrible. Maybe some people do, I take that back, but that's not generally our reaction. We try to heal what was hurt. And in the case of someone close to you, you have to look at what they said and determine whether or not any of it was true. Okay, which is kind of difficult if you're hurt, but you have to think at some point, you have to step back and say, was it true? One. Two, was this person in their right mind? Or were they angry? Or were they upset? And three, is there something going on about this person that I don't know? Right. Like someone who crosses the path, and which is one of my biggest banes, is people who cross cross lanes when I'm driving and force me off the lane, and I feel like my peace definitely gets altered at that point. But the point is that person may be going through somebody's help. There may be issues, so you don't know that. So all of these things come into play, but the most important thing is that you don't react in the moment, because reacting in the moment comes from ego, comes from your own self-interest. And when someone else is involved, you have to think about what their interests are. what their issues are. Maybe you can't do it at the moment. And I'll be first to admit, sometimes when someone says something hurtful, you can't just say, oh, okay, I understand. Maybe you don't understand. You have no idea what's going on. But you find out, you look for it. And that's to me the most important thing. You're not going to stop being provoked unless you live to move to become a hermit and or sannyasi and go somewhere where there's nobody there. That's what we're going to confront. But it's a question of how you deal with it, how you respond to it, how you deal with your own culpability in it, and how you deal with the other person's culpability in it and the context in which they say it. But there's no way that you're not going to be provoked. That's not happening. And again, the examples I used about peace, the people knew a great deal about being provoked. Okay, so okay, now there's a lot more questions. So
there's a bunch of questions. So I'm going to go to someone new because the person had two questions and hopefully we'll get back to them. But it's not a question, it's a point. And I agree, Dan, that you can be peaceful without being passive. I love that. Yes, it's definitely true. I never think of Gandhi or, as you mentioned, Mandela or Martin Luther King as being passive. In fact, they were the most transformative people probably in the recent history. So certainly not peaceful. So yes to that, Dan. There's another question. My understanding is that we lose peace worrying about what's going to happen in the future. That's the definition of anxiety. Depression is when you think of the past. Anxiety is when you think to the future and you're worried about your job, your relationship, your children, or your health. How do we find peace in the present without worrying about the future?
Well, that's a toughie.
I'm also going to answer that my way of doing it.
Okay, all right. Worrying about the future is something that you have to, and here I would have to put on the rationalist hat. Worrying about the future is looking. Someone did a fantastic anecdote about this, saying, worrying about the future is paying a mortgage on a property you haven't yet bought.
That's right.
All right. So you worry about the future because you're paying a mortgage on a property you haven't yet bought. So we all have issues about the future. I mean, I spent 2 years with my firm worrying about the future, constantly. But ultimately, when push came to shove and said, okay, am I going to survive or am I going to close shop and send these 13 families, 10 people that work with us home? Ultimately, what you do is you say, have I done what I can? Have I done, honestly, the best I could? Have I made the effort? Okay. If you feel that, and looking at it objectively, that you've made the best effort you can, that you really can't make any more effort, then to say, I need to do more effort is arrogance. Because you can't do more than what you can do. Only God gets to do that, okay? We don't get to do more than what we can do. That's the definition of being human. So that to me is the critical thing. Worrying about the future is a mixture of arrogance and a mixture of trying to define the world before it happens. Right. You really can't do that. But that doesn't mean you don't try as hard as you can to deal with the situation now, to deal with your job, to deal with your relationships, to deal with your children, to whatever it is. You do the best you can in the moment. Yeah. And to think that you are obliged to do more than that because more than that is required, that's arrogance. It may not be an arrogance like we normally define it, but it's the arrogance just the same. We cannot do more than what we are capable of. That's just the nature of our existence. And if we at least come to grips with that, then we have a chance of dealing with the things that we do have capability for. So that's how I would deal with the whole issue of worrying about the future. And I know this for 2 years, worrying about the future that I thought would never come. And, at some point I said, okay, I've done the best I can. If these people end up looking for jobs, I did everything I could. That's how you deal with worrying about the future, in my perspective. I'm sorry I took so long.
Oh, no, that was kind of what I would have said, that at the same token, I always go, how am I at this moment? How am I at this moment? And more often than not, at this moment, I am fine. So I focus from where I am. Also, I've learned for myself, 70% of what I worry about doesn't even happen. So as you said, to put a mortgage out on something you don't even own yet, I love that. So I think you answered that very well.
I stole that. I don't know who I stole it from, but I stole
That's
it.
all right. That's all right. That's a good thing that you can steal, and that you'll pay royalties to that person who did
Right.
it. So we have to come to a close because the hour is late. So you have to do like a 2-minute meditation because we're going over, because thank you all for your comments and your chat. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everything. There's a lot of questions in there. So that's good. I'm glad I knew it would be very engaging, Tony. So if you can just bring us to a meditation. The next time we're going to talk about expectations, because one of the questions were about expectations. I think you touched on it a little bit. Not to have too much expectations. That's one of my big
Have no expectations.
have no expectations.
No
Exactly.
expectations. That's
the way to go.
expectation is the killer.
That's
The killer of
exactly.
everything. The killer of relationships, killer of careers, killer of everything.
Only expect from myself, only what I can do.
Exactly.
And again, without being arrogant, to double
Right.
back on what you said,
Right.
the best that I can,
Yeah.
what others can do. I have no expectations anymore. It's all about me and God. So can you bring us to a commentary so we can wind down? It was wonderful, Tony. You did a great job. Go ahead.
Okay.
Bring us.
Okay. We need to take a moment to kind of stop all of the things swirling around our consciousness. Not to forget them, not to repress them, just to stop. Stop the movement. Just hold it still. And put yourself in the center of all of that. Look at it, observe it, but don't engage with it. And as you do that, you're able to distance yourself from all of these concerns. For a moment, they begin to recede in your consciousness. They begin to acquire a true perspective and value that they have in your life. For a moment, brief moment, as you distance yourself further and further into your consciousness, they become part of the background of your existence. In the foreground, you sit, your consciousness, independent of all of these other things going on. And you hold that moment that is your moment, your place, your time. And remember it, because that's a place you'll want to return to, hopefully again and again. And then you let go and you come back to the world of thoughts, complex resolutions, demands. but you come back with the consciousness that you have an alternative. You can always return there. Om Shanti.
Om Shanti, Brother Tony. Thank you so much for that very fulfilling evening. And there are a lot of signposts I can take with me and use in my practical world, which is what you all are very, very good at. So I really thank you for your words. I thank our audience for their thoughtful comments and questions and for hanging out with us. And I think Narayan is behind the IT. Thank you for that. And Brother Eric and everyone who helped out this evening. Next week, we are continuing with our piece, A Gift from God. And we're going to have one of our regulars, you know him well, Brother Eric, will be talking about receiving gifts. So let there be peace on earth, Tony, and let it begin with me. Okay. Thank you so much, Brother Tony, for joining us this evening. And thank you to God, without whom we would not be here. So thank you all. Good night, everyone. We'll see you next week. Om Shanti. Om Shanti.